I'm Miss Elizabeth, and this is part 4 of My Teacher is an Alien. My mouth went dry. My hands started shaking. Peter's eyes were so wide they looked like ping pong balls. Shh, cautioned Miss Schwartz. Don't make a sound. I appreciated the advice, but I'd already figured that much out on my own. What are we going to do, I thought. To my surprise, Miss Schwartz answered me. Wait till he reports in, she said. Then you can sneak out. Did you just read my mind? I thought. Just the messages you send me, she replied. Phew, what a relief. There's a lot going on inside my head that I don't want anybody to know about, not even Miss Schwartz. I looked around the attic. If Broxham came up here, we were stuck. I couldn't see a single thing to hide behind. Suddenly I heard that horrible music again. This is our chance, I whispered. He must be in his dressing room. I bet he's taken off his face and getting ready to report to the ship. Then let's go, said Peter. Wait, I said desperately. What about Miss Schwartz? We can't just leave her here like this. You have to, she thought at us. I'm all right for the time being. The best thing you can do for me is unmask the alien. I still hesitated. Go, she shouted inside my head. The message was so powerful I staggered back from the force field. Casting a last look over my shoulder, I took Peter's hand. He didn't pull away. We were both terrified. Each of us needed someone to hold on to as we sneaked down the stairway. When we reached the bottom, Peter opened the door as quietly as he could. The tiny click was lost in the awful screech of the alien music. Moving slowly, he peered around the edge. No one in sight, he whispered. Then let's go. My heart was pounding in my ears. I don't think I've ever been so frightened in my life. I had a feeling Broxham would jump out and grab us at any second. For one horrible instant, I wondered if the mirror on his dressing table might be at the right angle to show our reflections as we stepped out of the attic. I imagined him racing into the hallway, his Mr. Smith face hanging down around his chin, ready to turn us into a pair of puddles on the floor. Or whatever a person from his planet did to kids he caught snooping in his attic. The screeching music continued. Still moving slowly, Peter closed the door behind us. That seemed like a waste of time until I realized he was afraid that if he didn't secure it, the door might swing open after we let it go. One noise like that and we were dead. Dropping to our hands and knees, we crawled along the edge of the wall. I couldn't help it. When I was opposite the door of Broxham's room, I glanced in. Broxham was sitting there, peeling off his face. I prayed that he wouldn't see me, and I crept forward. We slid down the stairs, slipped out the front door, and ran for all we were worth. After about 3 blocks, we stopped to catch our breath. Oh, in addition to everything else, I was worried that since Broxham was back, my parents might be home too. But when we reached my house, I could see that I had made my way back first. That wasn't too surprising. My folks often stayed to gab with the other parents after the formal meeting was over. It was even possible that the meeting was still going on and Broxham had managed to slip out early. Peter walked me to the door. I thought that was brave of him, especially when I watched him walk off into the darkness and realized how frightened I would be if I had to go home alone. That skinny kid had more courage than anyone I knew. As for me, I was terrified. I went around and turned on every light in the house. And then I sat in the living room waiting for my parents to come home and worrying that Broxham might show up first. All in all, I had decided it had been a good night's work. Even if I hadn't found anything to prove my story, at least one other person now knew what was going on. And even more important, we had found Mrs. Schwartz. But what should we do now? The crucial thing was to reveal Broxham for what he really was. But how could we do that without getting turned into puddles on the floor? The only advantage was that he didn't know we knew his secret. If we could make whatever we did seem innocent, he might not guess what we were up to. Of course, the most obvious thing was still to pull his mask off. But how do you pull a mask off an alien's face? I spent the whole night trying to find the courage to do what I knew I had to do the next day. My music teacher had scheduled me for an extra lesson that morning. As usual, Mr. Smith shuddered when he saw me pick up my piccolo. Let him shudder. If he kidnapped me, maybe I'd play the piccolo all the way into the next galaxy. The reason for the extra lesson was that my music teacher wanted me to work on a solo he had asked me to play for the spring concert. We were doing the greatest marches of all times, Stars and Stripes Forever by John Philip Sousa. Anyway, the high point of the march is this incredibly neat, incredibly difficult piccolo solo. My music teacher told me way back in February that he wanted our band to do this march for 7 years, and he said he'd just been waiting until he had a piccolo player good enough to handle the solo. And now we had one. Me. I was flattered that he had so much faith in me, and the problem was I didn't have much faith in me. Oh, I could do most of the solo right, and most of the time. But that was that one trill near the end that I always messed up. Let me tell you, if you're ever going to play something in a concert, you don't want to get it almost right. You want it perfect. Well, Mr. Banwick was determined we would play Stars and Stripes Forever that spring, or die trying. The way my lesson was going that Friday, it looked like we were going to die. Come on, Susan, Mr. Banwick said after I messed up for the third time. The concert's next week. Did you practice last night? I shook my head. I didn't have time, I said. I know that sounded pretty lame, but how could I tell him I hadn't practiced because I'd been prowling in my teacher's house trying to find evidence that he was an alien. I could see Mr. Banwick trying to control himself. I have to give him credit. He knows it doesn't do any good to make a kid feel stupid. But I could tell he really wanted to explode. By the time I left the room, I was pretty upset myself. That wasn't all bad. Being angry gave me the strength to do what I knew I had to do. Taking a deep breath, I marched back to my classroom. I paused outside the door and took another deep breath. And then I went through the door, staggered over to Mr. Smith's desk, and pretended to faint. On the way down, I grabbed his ear. Failure. I had hoped to hit the floor with Mr. Smith's face in my hand and Broxham's real face exposed for all the world to see. Instead, I ended up with a handful of air and a bump on my head. The other kids in the class shouted and jumped to their feet. Mr. Smith waved them away. He told Mike Foran to go get the nurse. Then he knelt over me to see if I was all right. He was acting all concerned, and I almost felt bad for trying to pull his face off. But all I had to do was think of Mrs. Swartz trapped in that force field in his attic, and any guilt I might have felt floated right away. Susan, are you all right? He asked. I moaned and fluttered my eyes. Oh, what happened? You fainted, said Broxham. He patted the side of his head. Almost took my ear with ya, he said. He gave me a cute little smile that showed a dimple in his right cheek. Between the two of us, the air was thick with fake innocence. Was it really possible he didn't know what I was up to? A minute later, Mike came running back with Miss Glocka puffing along behind him. She checked my pulse, felt my forehead, and then helped me to her office to, surprise, lay down. She also decided to call my mother. This meant that I had to go home and then to the doctor's and then spend the rest of the afternoon in bed with my mother fussing and worrying about me. She even decided I had to spend the evening in bed, too. After she brought supper to my room. "Gracious, Susan," she said when she burst through the door. "This place looks like an explosion at a garage sale. Can't you keep it a little bit neater?" "I was planning to clean it today," I said, "only I don't feel up to it after I fainted." "Poor baby," she said, setting the tray on my nightstand. She seemed so pleased, I decided not to tell her I'd been kidding. She never could understand that I liked my room the way it was. After supper, I slipped out of bed and went to see my father. He was sitting in his den building a model of the Empire State Building out of toothpicks. That's his hobby, making famous buildings with toothpicks. If you ask me, it's pretty weird, but it keeps him happy, which is more than I can say for most adults I know. So I guess I shouldn't complain. "Hey, Pookie," he said when I walked in. "Feeling better?" I nodded, not wanting to tell him I hadn't been feeling bad to begin with. I sat down next to him and started handing him toothpicks. "So, what's on your mind tonight?" he said, holding up a toothpick and dabbing a bit of glue on the end of it. "Dad," I said, but that was all I could think of. I tried, but I just couldn't bring myself to explain the situation. After a full minute of silence, he turned to me and said, "Are you all right, Susan?" I knew he was really concerned because he let the glue on the end of the toothpick dry out while he was waiting for my answer. "I'm fine," I said at last. "Well, not exactly fine. I've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" he asked. He put down his toothpick and gave me his full attention. Oh, this was terrible. Can you imagine trying to tell your father that your teacher is an alien? He was going to think I was out of my mind. But I had to do something, so I took a deep breath and said, "It's about Mr. Smith." He nodded, inviting me to continue. "Look, I tried, I really did, but I just couldn't bring myself to say the words, 'My teacher is an alien.' After a long, uncomfortable silence, I finally said, 'I don't think he likes me very much.'" Dad looked appropriately worried. "Why not?" he asked. "Well, he shudders when he sees me go to my music lesson." I hope that might sound weird enough to get him to ask other questions. "Come on, Dad, help me," I thought. "Ask the right questions." But he just laughed. "Well, as long as Mr. Smith doesn't actually say anything, I don't think you could complain too much. Maybe the guy just doesn't like music. Not everybody can be as cultured as we are, you know. He's probably just a Philistine." Yeah, I thought a Philistine from the planet Phyllis. But all I said out loud was, "Yeah, a Philistine." Figuring he had solved my problem, Dad turned back to his toothpicks. "I wouldn't let it get to you, honey," he said. "The school year's almost over. You can tough it out until then. But you better scoot back to bed before your mother catches you out here." I gave him a hug and trudged back to my room. Now what? If I was going to do anything about this mess, I had to get some proof and fast. I was still trying to figure that all out when Peter called. "Nice try today," he said. "You're really brave. I just hope Broxham didn't figure out what you were up to." Great. That was the last thing in the world I wanted to think about. "I wasn't brave," I said, "just desperate. What I want to know is, what are we going to do next? We've got to find a way to prove the truth about Broxham." "Actually, that's why I'm calling you," Peter said. "I wanted to know if you had a camera." "Sure, why?" He hesitated and then said, "Well, are you game for another expedition into Broxham's lair?" I smiled for the first time that day. "So we can take a picture of Miss Swartz." "Peter, you're brilliant. Only, when can we be sure he won't be there?" "How about during school?" "Peter, I can't skip school. My mother would kill me." "Would you rather get kidnapped by aliens?" he asked. I sighed. "All right, I'll bring my camera to school on Monday. We'll talk about it then." I hung up and tried not to think about the fact that in 2 days I was going back into the alien's den. In fact, I spent most of that whole long sleepless night trying not to think about it. I didn't think it was all that weird when Stacy Benoit called me Saturday morning to see how I was doing. After all, she is my friend, and she did think I had fainted in school the day before. I didn't realize when I laughed and told her there wasn't anything wrong with me that I was only confirming her worst fears. I didn't figure out that until Monday morning when our class turned into something from the Twilight Zone. Until that point, I had other things to worry about, like what to do about Ms. Schwartz. Since my mother still wouldn't let me out of the house, I spent a long time discussing this force field thing with Peter over the phone. He actually told me he was pretty sure Miss Schwartz was safer inside that thing than she would be walking the streets. She probably doesn't like it in there, he said, and I know I wouldn't, but there's nothing that's going to hurt her. Well, doesn't she have to eat or go to the bathroom or something? I asked. I could almost see Peter shrug over the telephone line. I don't think so, he said. I have a feeling time is pretty much holding still inside that thing. So unless she had to go to the bathroom when he put her in there, she's probably fine. He paused and then added, come to think of it, that force field would be a woman's dream. She won't age a bit. Don't be a male chauvinist piglet. This is serious. I know it's serious, snapped Peter, but we can't do anything about it this weekend, unless you know of a time when we can be sure that Broxham won't be there. I suppose you're right, I said. But the thought of Miss Schwartz trapped in that force field gnawed away at me for all the rest of the day and all of Sunday, too. I had to get her out of there. I was still stewing about it on Monday until things got so weird that I forgot about Miss Schwartz for a while. It started with Donald Dougal, who walked into class carrying the biggest apple I had ever seen in my life. Good morning, Mr. Smith, he said. How are you today? His voice was so syrupy sweet it made me want to throw up. I looked away and then I looked back again, so fast it put a crook in my neck. Duncan, I thought in astonishment. The class bully put his apple on Mr. Smith's desk and then went to his own desk, sat down, and folded his hands neatly in front of him. I squeezed my eyes shut and then opened them again to see if anything would change, but the apple was still there, and Duncan was still sitting in his desk, smiling like a little angel. What was going on here? When I opened my desk, I found a note that said, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. And it was signed, a friend. Who would it come from and why? I looked around the room, but the others were all bent over their desks, working busily away. I turned back to my work, trying to figure out what was going on. But even the weird stuff that had happened so far hadn't prepared me for what happened next. You pig-faced baboon! Yelled a familiar voice. Stacy? Stacy Benoit? The girl most likely to be declared a saint while still living? I turned around and saw Stacy standing beside her desk, shouting at Mike Foran. The only kid I had ever heard of who never, and I mean never, got in trouble with a teacher. Shut up, yelled Mike. Shut up, you creep. When Stacy slapped him across the face, I almost fell out of my chair. Of course, Stacy couldn't slap that well, having never done it before. So it was kind of a wimpy little slap, but this was Stacy Benoit, for heaven's sakes. Stacy, yelled Mr. Smith, who was sitting at the back of the room with a reading group. Michael, what's going on up there? He started for the front of the room, but he was too late. When Stacy slapped Mike, he jumped up so fast he knocked his desk over. His face was red. I didn't realize until later it was from stage fright. Your mother wears I wanted to prompt him. It was pathetic to see the nicest kid in class try to come up with a withering insult, and even more pathetic when he finally finished up with, "Your mother wears polyester!" But it seemed to do the trick. Stacy began to shriek in outrage. Mr. Smith reached them just in time to keep them from going at each other's throats. "The rest of you stay in your seats," he ordered. "I'll be back in a minute." Then he walked out the door, dragging the two best behaved kids in 6th grade along with him. They were kicking and screaming every step of the way. I closed my eyes and shook my head. I was sure I was awake. So what was going on? Was this the same planet I'd gone to sleep on? I couldn't wait till recess so I could talk to Peter. And we'll find out what Peter has to say in part 5.